What started as a routine 30-hour fishing trip turned into the longest survival at sea in human history. José Salvador Alvarenga and his companion set out from Mexico's Pacific coast on November 17, 2012, expecting to return the next day with their catch. Instead, they found themselves battling a storm that damaged their motor within hours, setting in motion the drift that would last 438 days. Only one of them would survive to tell this story, and the surprising survival tactics he developed in total isolation reveal just how far human endurance can be pushed when faced with the ocean's vast emptiness. The Pacific Ocean's deadly scale in 2025. The Pacific Ocean covers 1/3 of Earth's entire surface, stretching across distances that dwarf every continent combined. This massive body of water extends from the Arctic in the north to the Antarctic in the south, and from Asia and Australia in the west to the Americas in the east. The distance between its furthest points measures over 19,000 kilometers, which means a commercial airliner flying at cruising speed would take nearly 21 hours to cross it in a straight line. Modern satellite technology has mapped every square meter of the Pacific surface with precision that would have seemed impossible just decades ago. Advanced tracking systems can pinpoint locations with remarkable accuracy, while radar satellites can detect objects as small as a life raft floating on the surface. Weather monitoring stations track storm systems in real time, and oceanographic buoys measure currents, temperatures, and wave heights across the entire basin. Despite this technological sophistication, the sheer scale of the Pacific makes rescue operations face odds that remain mathematically impossible to overcome. Current shipping lane data reveals that the vast majority of the Pacific Ocean remains completely empty of vessel traffic on any given day. The major shipping routes form narrow corridors between continents, leaving vast expanses of open water that no commercial vessel will traverse for months at a time. These shipping lanes concentrate around specific routes connecting major ports in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Tokyo, Shanghai, Sydney, and Panama. But between these corridors lie millions of square kilometers, where a person could drift for years without seeing another human being. The Northern Pacific route between North America and Asia sees the heaviest traffic. Yet even this busiest corridor represents less than 1% of the ocean's total surface area. Maritime dead zones exist throughout the Pacific, where even 2025 rescue technology struggles to operate effectively. These areas lie beyond the range of helicopter rescue operations, which typically extend only 300 nautical miles from shore. Coast Guard vessels cannot reach these zones quickly enough to matter during most emergencies, and weather conditions often prevent aircraft from conducting search operations for days at a time. The Central Pacific Gyre, a massive rotating current system, creates a particularly dangerous dead zone where debris and lost vessels can circle for years without approaching any inhabited land. Satellite coverage in these areas remains limited because the cost of monitoring such vast empty spaces exceeds the practical benefits for most rescue organizations. Modern search and rescue missions follow strict protocols that typically call off operations after 72 hours in open ocean conditions due to plummeting survival odds. This time frame reflects cold calculations about survival probability and resource allocation rather than any lack of concern for human life. Search patterns must expand outward from the last known position, creating search areas that grow by thousands of square kilometers each day. A person lost for 72 hours could be anywhere within a circle covering 50,000 square kilometers, assuming average current speeds and weather conditions. Survival statistics paint a grim picture of human endurance in Pacific Ocean conditions. The average person survives only 3 to 5 days without fresh water, and ocean conditions accelerate dehydration through salt exposure, sun damage, and the physical stress of staying afloat. Hypothermia can kill within hours in northern Pacific waters, while southern regions present the opposite threat of fatal heat exposure. The human body loses approximately 2 to 3 liters of water per day through normal processes, but exposure to salt water and sun can double or triple this rate. Most people cannot survive more than 7 days without water under ideal conditions, and ocean survival presents conditions that are far from ideal. GPS emergency beacons and satellite phones have reduced ocean survival incidents by 89% since 2012, transforming maritime safety in ways that would have saved countless lives in previous decades. Personal locator beacons can transmit distress signals to satellites anywhere on Earth, providing rescue coordinates accurate to within meters. Modern satellite phones work in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with the same reliability as land-based cellular networks. Emergency position indicating radio beacons automatically activate when they contact salt water, broadcasting location data that rescue services can track in real time. These devices have created a safety net that covers previously unreachable areas of the Pacific. Despite all technological advances, being lost in the Pacific without emergency equipment still means almost certain death. The ocean's size defeats even the most sophisticated rescue systems when people disappear without transmitting a distress signal. Weather conditions can disable satellites and prevent aircraft from conducting rescue operations for days at a time. Ocean currents move at unpredictable speeds and directions, carrying people far from their last known positions before rescue operations can begin. The Pacific's depth averages over 4,000 meters, which means that equipment failures or accidents often leave no trace for rescue teams to follow. New 2025 systems combine satellites, drones, and AI to focus searches hours after distress signals, while computer models can predict drift patterns with unprecedented accuracy. Automated distress detection systems monitor radio frequencies for emergency transmissions, and international coordination protocols ensure that rescue resources can be deployed across national boundaries. Yet the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. The mathematical reality of Pacific Ocean survival creates a paradox that defies human comprehension. A person floating in the Pacific has approximately the same chance of being found as a specific grain of sand on a beach. Ocean currents can carry someone 50 kilometers in a single day, while weather conditions limit search flights to specific hours when visibility and wind conditions permit safe operations. Even with perfect weather and unlimited resources, covering the search area for a week-old emergency would require thousands of aircraft working simultaneously. Anyone surviving longer than a week in these conditions enters territory that challenges everything we know about human endurance. The longest confirmed survival times in ocean conditions rarely exceed 10 to 14 days, making extended survival seem impossible rather than improbable. The human body simply lacks the resources to function without fresh water, food, and shelter for extended periods. Exposure to salt water causes skin breakdown and infection, while constant sun exposure leads to severe burns and dehydration. The psychological stress of isolation and hopelessness often proves fatal even when physical survival remains possible. Alvarenga's survival represents an anomaly that defies every known statistic about ocean survival in the modern era. His 438-day ordeal occurred in an environment where rescue services expected to find only bodies after the first week of searching. Yet for one experienced fisherman working the waters off Mexico's Pacific coast, what began as a routine day would soon test these impossible odds. The fishing trip that changed everything. November 17, 2012, began like thousands of other days for José Salvador Alvarenga in the small fishing village of Costa Azul, Mexico. The sun rose over the Pacific horizon as it had for decades, casting the same golden light across the weathered docks where generations of fishermen had prepared their boats for another day at sea. Alvarenga went through his morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent most of his adult life working these waters. He checked his equipment, reviewed weather conditions, and prepared for what seemed like just another fishing trip. The economic pressures driving fishermen like Alvarenga to take risks were brutal and unforgiving. A single successful day catching sharks, marlins, and sailfish could generate income equivalent to a full week of wages for most families in the region. This harsh financial reality meant that fishermen regularly pushed the boundaries of safety, venturing further from shore and staying out longer than might be wise. The Pacific waters off Mexico's coast held valuable fish species that commanded high prices in local markets. But reaching the prime fishing grounds required traveling significant distances from the safety of coastal waters. For experienced fishermen like Alvarenga, these calculated risks were simply part of making a living from the sea. His fishing vessel represented typical equipment for small-scale Pacific coast operations in 2012. The 7-meter fiberglass skiff featured no cabin or protective covering, leaving its occupants completely exposed to sun, wind, and waves. A single outboard motor provided propulsion, while a refrigerator-sized icebox offered the only storage space for their hope for catch. The boat carried basic navigation equipment, including a simple radio and compass, but lacked the sophisticated safety systems that would become standard in later years. Compared to modern 2025 fishing vessel safety standards, Alvarenga's boat was essentially a floating death trap. Today's mandatory GPS tracking systems, automated distress beacons, and weather alert networks simply did not exist for small fishing operations in 2012. Weather reports indicated storm activity developing in the area, but Alvarenga and his companion made the calculated decision to proceed with their fishing plans. This choice reflected both the economic pressures they faced and the confidence that came from years of experience working these waters. Modern fishing operations in 2025 operate under strict protocols that prohibit departing when weather warnings are issued, but such regulations were not enforced in 2012. Fishermen relied on their own judgment, local knowledge, and basic weather information that often proved inadequate for predicting rapidly changing ocean conditions. The routine preparations that morning would soon transform into life-or-death survival tools. Loading the small refrigerator with ice seemed like standard procedure for preserving their catch, but this equipment would later provide crucial storage for rainwater. The basic radio they carried for communication with shore would become their only link to the outside world until its battery died. Even their minimal food supplies, packed for a planned 30-hour trip, would need to last far longer than anyone could imagine. Every piece of equipment loaded onto their small boat that morning carried significance that neither man could have anticipated. Ezequiel Córdoba joined Alvarenga as his fishing partner for this trip, creating a partnership that would face the ultimate test of human endurance. Córdoba was younger and less experienced than Alvarenga, but eager to earn his share of the profits from a successful fishing expedition. The two men had worked together before and understood each other's strengths and weaknesses on the water. Their relationship represented the kind of working partnership common among small-scale fishermen, where trust and cooperation were essential for both success and survival. The journey to their chosen fishing grounds required traveling 120 kilometers from the safety of Costa Azul's protected harbor. This distance represented more than just physical space. It measured the gap between civilization and the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. As their small boat moved further from shore, the familiar landmarks of the Mexican coast gradually disappeared behind them. The mountains that marked the location of their home village became smaller and more distant with each passing hour. Radio communications with shore grew weaker as they approached the outer limits of their equipment's range. Storm warnings continued to reach them through their radio as they traveled toward the fishing grounds, but both men chose to ignore these increasingly urgent messages. Their decision reflected the dangerous confidence that comes from years of successful fishing trips and the belief that their experience could overcome whatever challenges the ocean might present. The warnings described deteriorating weather conditions and advised all small craft to return to port immediately, but the potential profits from a successful fishing day outweighed these concerns in their minds. Weather forecasting technology in 2012 lacked the precision and real-time updating capabilities that fishermen rely on today. Satellite imagery was less detailed, computer models were less accurate, and communication systems were more limited than the comprehensive weather monitoring networks available in 2025. Modern fishermen receive constant updates about wind speeds, wave heights, and storm movements through GPS-enabled devices that connect directly to meteorological databases. These technological advances have dramatically reduced the number of fishing vessels caught in dangerous weather conditions. As they reach their intended fishing spot, Both men focused on the work ahead of them. They prepared their fishing lines, checked their equipment, and began the process of locating and catching the valuable fish species that made their long journey worthwhile. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions around their tiny vessel, but this vastness seemed manageable to experienced fishermen who had worked these waters for years. The storm that would change everything was already building strength on the horizon, though its true intensity remained hidden from their view. Dark clouds gathered in the distance, while wind patterns began shifting in ways that suggested the weather warnings they had dismissed were about to prove catastrophically accurate. Neither man realized they were about to face conditions that would test every survival skill they possessed. When the storm hit at 1 a.m., the Pacific Ocean transformed from a manageable fishing ground into a killing machine. The storm struck with violence that caught both men completely off guard, turning their small boat into a cork bobbing in chaos. Waves that had been gentle swells just hours earlier now towered above their 7-meter vessel, threatening to crush them with tons of water. The wind howled with a sound neither man had heard before, drowning out their shouts to each other as they struggled to maintain control of their boat. Lightning illuminated the ocean around them in brief, terrifying flashes that revealed the true scale of the waves bearing down on them. The storm's intensity exceeded every weather prediction they had received. Meteorologists had warned of rough conditions, but nothing in their forecasts suggested the monster that now surrounded their tiny vessel. Wind speeds reached levels that turned ordinary ocean spray into stinging projectiles, while waves built to heights that dwarfed their boat. The storm created a wall of water and wind that seemed designed to destroy everything in its path. Modern weather prediction systems in 2025 would have detected this storm's true power days in advance, but the limited forecasting technology of 2012 had completely underestimated what was coming. Faced with immediate disaster, Alvarenga and Córdoba made split-second decisions that would determine their fate. They cut their fishing lines with desperate efficiency, abandoning the catch that had brought them so far from shore. Everything they had worked for that day went overboard as they dumped their gear, their ice, and anything else that might weigh down their boat or catch the wind. The refrigerator that had been meant to preserve their fish became dead weight that threatened to sink them. These actions saved their lives in the short term by making their boat more maneuverable, but also stripped away equipment they would desperately need later. The storm created waves that crashed over their boat with crushing force, filling it with water faster than they could bail it out. Each wave threatened to be the one that would flip their vessel completely over or drive it beneath the surface permanently. The men took turns steering, while the other used whatever containers they could find to throw water back into the ocean. Their small motor screamed at maximum power as Alvarenga fought to keep the bow pointed into the waves, knowing that taking one of these monsters broadside would end their lives instantly. For 6 hours, they battled through darkness and mountainous seas in a desperate race back toward the Mexican coast. The storm seemed to follow them, maintaining its intensity as they struggled through the night. Navigation became impossible in the chaos, with their compass spinning wildly and familiar landmarks erased by sheets of rain and spray. They could only head in what they hoped was the direction of shore, praying that their motor would hold out long enough to reach safety. The physical exhaustion of fighting the storm for hours left both men drained, but stopping their efforts meant certain death. Dawn brought the most beautiful sight either man had ever seen. The mountains of the Mexican coast appeared on the horizon like a promise of salvation. They were only 24 kilometers from shore, close enough to make out individual peaks and valleys that marked familiar territory. The storm had begun to weaken, though dangerous swells still rocked their boat. Both men felt a surge of hope as they realized they had survived the worst night of their lives and were almost home. The village of Costa Azul lay somewhere behind those mountains, along with families who had probably spent the night worrying about their safe return. At that moment of approaching triumph, disaster struck with devastating timing. Their motor coughed, sputtered, and died completely. The engine that had carried them through 6 hours of hell chose the worst possible moment to fail. Without power, their boat immediately became a victim of the wind and current rather than a vessel under their control. The silence after the motor died was more terrifying than all the noise of the storm had been. They tried frantically to restart the engine, pulling the cord again and again, but it remained dead. The mountains that had seemed so close suddenly felt impossibly far away. Their radio still worked, offering one final lifeline to the world they were about to leave behind. Alvarenga grabbed the handset and broadcast their position with desperate urgency, explaining that their motor had failed and they were drifting away from shore. The voice of their boss crackled through the static, clear enough to understand his response that he was coming to find them. For a few precious minutes, rescue seemed possible. Another boat was already heading in their direction, and their exact location was known. All they had to do was wait and try to stay in the same area until help arrived. The radio battery died with a final electronic wheeze, cutting their last connection to the outside world. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. No more voices from shore, no more updates about rescue efforts, no more human contact of any kind. The psychological impact of that moment was devastating. They had been talking to safety just seconds before, and now they were completely alone in the vast Pacific. The radio had been their lifeline, their proof that people on shore knew where they were and were coming to help. The unusually strong winds that had helped create the storm now became their worst enemy. Despite being only 24 kilometers from shore, the wind began pushing their powerless boat back toward the open ocean. They watched helplessly as the distance between them and safety grew larger with each passing hour. The mountains became smaller and less distinct as the current carried them away from everything they knew. Without paddles, oars, or sails, they had no way to fight the forces that were dragging them toward the deep Pacific. The mountains of Mexico grew smaller and fainter as the hours passed, until they disappeared entirely below the horizon. The familiar coastline that had marked the boundary of their world was gone, replaced by empty ocean that extended beyond the limits of vision. Both men understood that they were now facing a situation that few people had ever survived. Back on shore, someone had heard their final radio transmission and knew exactly where to begin looking for them. The search that couldn't find them. The boss, who had promised to come for them, launched an immediate search operation within hours of losing radio contact. He organized fishing boats from Costa Azul and neighboring villages, creating a small fleet of vessels that began combing the waters where Alvarenga and Córdoba had last been heard from. These local fishermen knew the area better than anyone and understood the currents, weather patterns, and likely drift directions better than any official rescue service. They searched through the night and into the next day, covering the most probable locations where the disabled boat might have drifted. Search and rescue technology in 2012 relied heavily on visual searches from ships and aircraft, methods that proved painfully inadequate for the vast Pacific Ocean. Coast Guard aircraft flew predetermined search patterns, but pilots had to rely on their eyes to spot a 7-meter boat in an ocean that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Radio equipment could only detect distress signals within limited ranges, and without an active beacon, the missing boat was essentially invisible to electronic detection systems. Weather conditions made aerial searches even more difficult, with clouds, rain, and rough seas reducing visibility to almost nothing during crucial search periods. Mexican Pacific Coast search and rescue operations in 2012 followed protocols that reflected the reality of limited resources and vast search areas. The Mexican Navy coordinated with Coast Guard units and local fishing fleets, but their success rates for finding missing vessels dropped dramatically after the first 24 hours. Statistics showed that most successful rescues occurred within 6 hours of the initial distress call, with very few people found alive after 48 hours in open ocean conditions. The combination of strong currents, unpredictable weather, and the sheer size of the search area created mathematical challenges that even unlimited resources could not overcome. The search radius expanded exponentially as each day passed without finding any trace of the missing fishermen. On day 1, searchers focused on a circle roughly 50 kilometers in diameter around the last known position. By day 2, ocean currents and wind could have carried the boat anywhere within a 200-kilometer radius. Day 3 expanded the possible search area to over 100,000 square kilometers, an area larger than most countries. The mathematical impossibility of the situation became clear as searchers realized they were looking for a tiny boat in an area that would take weeks to cover completely. From the searchers' perspective, the frustration was overwhelming. They knew 2 men were somewhere out there, probably still alive, but the ocean had swallowed them completely. Fishing boats reported finding debris that might have come from Alvarenga's vessel, but nothing that could confirm their location or condition. Aircraft pilots flew grid patterns for hours, straining their eyes against the glare of sun on water, hoping to spot anything that might indicate where the missing boat had gone. Radio operators monitored emergency frequencies constantly, listening for any signal that might indicate the men were still alive and trying to communicate. The psychological toll on search teams grew heavier with each passing day. These were local fishermen searching for their colleagues, people they knew personally who had families waiting for news. Every false sighting raised hopes that were then crushed when the object turned out to be floating debris or a distant seabird. The weather continued to deteriorate, making search conditions even more dangerous for the rescue boats and aircraft. The pilots reported visibility so poor that they could barely see their own aircraft wings, let alone spot a small boat on the ocean surface. After 5 days of intensive searching, the heartbreaking decision came to call off the operation due to resource limitations. The Mexican authorities had exhausted their available aircraft hours and fuel budgets, while local fishing boats could not continue to search without risking their own economic survival. The official search covered approximately 15,000 square kilometers, but this represented only a fraction of the area where the missing boat might have drifted. Weather conditions had prevented effective searching for 2 of the 5 days, further reducing the actual coverage of the search operation. The cruel mathematics of ocean drift meant that by day 5, Alvarenga's boat had already traveled approximately 450 kilometers from their last known position. Ocean currents in that area typically move at speeds of 2 to 4 kilometers per hour, but the storm that had disabled their boat had also accelerated their drift toward the open Pacific. While search teams were still focusing on areas within 200 kilometers ashore, the actual boat was already beyond any realistic rescue zone. The gap between where searchers looked and where the boat actually was grew larger every hour, making rescue impossible even if unlimited resources had been available. Modern 2025 search capabilities would have dramatically changed the outcome of this rescue operation. The Medium Earth Orbit Search and Rescue System can triangulate distress signals within 5 minutes, providing location accuracy to within 100 meters. AI-powered pattern recognition systems can analyze satellite imagery in real time, identifying objects as small as life rafts floating on the ocean surface. Drone technology has extended search capabilities far beyond the range of traditional aircraft, with autonomous units that can search for days without human intervention using thermal imaging, radar, and visual spectrum cameras simultaneously. Reinforcement learning algorithms in 2025 can dynamically adjust search patterns based on real-time ocean current data, potentially reducing search areas by up to 10,000 square kilometers in open ocean scenarios. These systems process weather data, current measurements, and historical drift patterns to create probability maps that guide search aircraft to the most likely locations. The U.S. Coast Guard's AI initiative can analyze social media posts to identify potential distress situations, processing over 1 million posts daily with 85% accuracy in identifying genuine emergencies. While people on shore conducted their desperate search, Alvarenga and Córdoba were already drifting beyond any realistic rescue zone. The Pacific Ocean had claimed them as completely as if they had disappeared from the face of the earth. Their families waited for news that would never come, while the 2 men faced the terrifying reality that they were now completely alone in the vastness of the ocean. With no rescue coming and no way to return to shore, their survival would depend entirely on what they could create from the few resources floating with them on their tiny boat. Survival techniques that kept them alive. Their 7-meter fiberglass boat offered absolutely no protection from the elements that would assault them for the next 438 days. The storm had stripped away most of their equipment, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever they could salvage from their damaged vessel. No food supplies remained after they had dumped everything overboard during the storm, and their fresh water was limited to whatever they could collect from rain that might fall. The boat's open design meant constant exposure to blazing sun during the day and cold ocean spray at night, with no cabin or shelter to provide relief from the relentless assault of wind and waves. Alvarenga quickly discovered that survival meant becoming a predator in an environment where he had always been the hunter. Small fish swimming near their boat became targets for his bare hands, requiring patience and lightning-fast reflexes to catch them before they escaped. He learned to grab birds that landed on their boat by the leg, breaking their wings to prevent escape before consuming every edible part of their bodies. The technique required perfect timing and absolute stillness, waiting motionless for hours until a seabird grew comfortable enough to land within reach. His hands became tools for survival, developing the sensitivity to detect the slightest movement in the water that might indicate the presence of fish. Floating plastic bottles, discovered drifting past their boat, transformed their desperate situation into something barely manageable. These discarded containers became the foundation of their water collection system, allowing them to catch and store rainwater that would otherwise have been lost to the ocean. Alvarenga arranged the bottles strategically around their boat, creating a network of collection points that could capture water from multiple directions during storms. The bottles required constant maintenance, cleaning out salt deposits, and ensuring they remained functional despite the harsh conditions that threatened to destroy everything they touched. Rainwater collection became a science of desperation that required perfect timing and absolute efficiency. When clouds appeared on the horizon, both men would prepare their collection system with religious devotion, knowing that missing a single drop might mean the difference between life and death. They learned to read weather patterns with supernatural accuracy, detecting the approach of rain-bearing clouds hours before the first drops fell. During dry periods that stretched for weeks, they watched their water supplies dwindle with growing panic, knowing that without rain, their ordeal would end in agonizing death from dehydration. The absence of fresh water forced them to consume substances that would horrify anyone living in normal circumstances. Turtle blood became a regular part of their diet, providing both hydration and essential nutrients that their bodies desperately needed. When they caught sea turtles, they would drink the blood immediately while it was still warm, knowing that this disgusting practice might keep them alive for another day. Their own urine became another source of liquid when no other options remained. Though this desperate measure carried its own risks and provided only temporary relief from the constant threat of dehydration, every creature they caught provided multiple resources that extended far beyond simple nutrition. Raw fish flesh supplied protein and calories, while fish blood offered additional hydration. Turtle shells became tools for collecting water and cutting other materials, while bird bones could be fashioned into hooks for catching more fish. Nothing was wasted in their floating prison, where every scrap of organic matter might serve a purpose they had not yet discovered. The liver of small sharks provided concentrated nutrition that helped sustain them through the longest periods without food, though the taste was so revolting that consuming it required tremendous willpower. The physical deterioration caused by constant sun exposure, salt water contact, and severe malnutrition transformed their bodies into barely recognizable versions of their former selves. Alvarenga's skin became leather-like from months of unprotected exposure to tropical sun, while salt water created painful sores that refused to heal in the constantly damp environment. His muscles atrophied from lack of proper nutrition and the inability to exercise normally in their confined space. Weight loss became so severe that his clothes hung like rags on his shrinking frame, providing little protection from the elements that continued to assault him day after day. Creating shelter from their limited resources required constant innovation and adaptation as their situation evolved. A styrofoam box that had originally stored fish became their primary protection from the sun when flipped upside down, though it was barely large enough to shelter one person at a time. They took turns crawling underneath this makeshift shelter, hunched over in positions so uncomfortable that doctors later discovered they had developed slipped vertebrae from maintaining these awkward postures for months. Their clothing was repurposed into additional protection, with shirts and pants arranged to create shade and wind barriers that made their situation slightly more bearable. The mental techniques required to maintain hope became as important as any physical survival skill they developed. They created elaborate fantasies about life on shore, describing in detail the meals they would eat and the people they would see when they returned to civilization. Alvarenga would spend hours describing imaginary walks along familiar beaches, complete with conversations with friends and family members who had no idea of his desperate situation. These mental exercises provided psychological relief from the crushing reality of their situation, allowing them to maintain sanity when the physical suffering became almost unbearable. Games played with the stars became nightly entertainment that helped pass the endless hours of darkness. They invented stories about the constellations, created imaginary characters who lived among the stars, and developed elaborate scenarios that could occupy their minds for hours at a time. These mental diversions were crucial for preventing the complete psychological breakdown that would have meant death even if their bodies remained capable of survival. The ability to escape mentally from their physical reality became as important as finding food and water for maintaining their will to live. These primitive survival methods sustained them through the first months of their ordeal, but the human body and mind can only endure so much punishment before something breaks. As weeks turned into months, the constant struggle was taking a toll that went far beyond what either man had imagined possible. The tragic death of Ezequiel Córdoba. For months into their ordeal, Córdoba's body and mind began breaking down in ways that made continued survival seem impossible. The constant diet of raw fish, turtle blood, and rainwater had devastated his digestive system, causing severe illness that left him weak and unable to contribute to their survival efforts. His body had begun consuming itself to stay alive, creating a downward spiral where each day brought more physical deterioration. The lack of essential nutrients, combined with months of exposure to blazing sun and salt water, had transformed him into a barely recognizable version of his former self. His skin had become leather-like from constant sun exposure, while infected sores refused to heal in the perpetually damp environment. The psychological impact of watching his body deteriorate while floating helplessly in endless ocean created a mental breakdown that proved impossible to reverse. Córdoba's mind began rejecting the reality of their situation, creating a disconnect between his physical suffering and his ability to process what was happening to him. The constant threat of death, combined with complete isolation from everything familiar, shattered his mental fortitude in ways that made continued survival feel meaningless. The overwhelming sense of hopelessness grew stronger each day as he realized their ordeal might continue indefinitely with no possibility of rescue or escape. The terror of consuming more raw food, combined with his body's rejection of everything they caught, led Córdoba to make the conscious decision to stop eating entirely. This choice represented the final stage of his psychological collapse, where the act of survival itself became unbearable. His refusal to consume any nutrition marked the beginning of a starvation process that would prove irreversible despite Alvarenga's desperate attempts to keep him alive. The sight of raw fish and turtle meat that had sustained them for months now filled him with revulsion that made eating impossible rather than simply unpleasant. Alvarenga fought frantically to prevent his companion from surrendering to despair, using every technique he could imagine to maintain Córdoba's will to live. He created elaborate fantasies about their eventual rescue, describing in detail the meals they would eat and the people they would see when they returned to civilization. These imaginary scenarios became desperate attempts to provide psychological relief from their crushing reality, giving Córdoba something to hope for beyond their immediate suffering. Alvarenga tried putting food on toothpicks to make it easier for Córdoba to eat, but his companion's terror of food and the situation had progressed beyond any simple solution. The caregiving relationship that developed between the two men revealed the power of human connection, even in the most desperate circumstances. Alvarenga's attempts to keep Córdoba alive through stories and imaginary meals reinforced his own inner strength, creating a sense of responsibility that motivated his daily existence. This caregiving became a crucial anchor that prevented Alvarenga from succumbing to the same despair that was destroying his companion. The act of trying to save someone else gave meaning to his own survival efforts, creating a purpose that extended beyond simple self-preservation. Watching someone die slowly from starvation and despair created psychological trauma that would haunt Alvarenga for the rest of his ordeal. The process was not quick or peaceful, but a gradual dissolution that took weeks to complete. Córdoba's body consumed itself from within while his mind retreated further from reality each day. The helplessness of being unable to save his companion despite desperate efforts created guilt that compounded the already overwhelming stress of their situation. Every day that Córdoba lived brought both hope that he might recover and the awful knowledge that his condition was deteriorating beyond any possibility of improvement. The impossible decision of what to do with Córdoba's body after he died presented both practical and moral challenges that had no good solutions. Their tiny boat could barely accommodate 2 living people, and a decomposing body created health risks that threatened Alvarenga's own survival. The smell became unbearable in the confined space, while the psychological impact of sharing his floating prison with a corpse pushed him toward complete mental breakdown. He kept the body on board for 6 days, conversing with it regularly as if Córdoba were still alive, before the reality of his situation forced him to make an unthinkable choice. The act of throwing his companion's body overboard represented one of the most traumatic moments in an ordeal filled with unimaginable horrors. Alvarenga had to overcome every instinct about respecting the dead while accepting that keeping the body would likely kill him as well. The fear that he was going insane from talking to a corpse added another layer of psychological terror to his already desperate situation. This decision marked the end of shared suffering and the beginning of complete isolation that would test his sanity in ways that no human should have to endure. Córdoba's death transformed Alvarenga's survival from a shared ordeal into a battle against complete isolation that stretched beyond the limits of human endurance. The loss of his companion meant the end of conversation, shared decision-making, and the psychological comfort that comes from knowing another human being shares your suffering. The boat that had been cramped with 2 people now felt impossibly large and empty, with only 1 occupant. The silence became deafening after months of constant communication with another person, creating a new form of torture that threatened to destroy his will to continue. Alvarenga contemplated suicide for 4 days after Córdoba died, understanding that ending his own life would be easier than continuing to endure the unbearable loneliness and suffering. His Christian faith provided the crucial anchor that prevented him from taking his own life, creating a reason to continue living when every rational consideration suggested that death would be preferable. This resilience highlighted the power of deeply held beliefs to sustain human life even when all hope seems lost. The loss that could have broken his will to survive somehow became the foundation for an even more remarkable demonstration of human endurance. The vast Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly around his tiny boat, and he was now completely alone in its immensity. Alone in the endless blue. Solitude in this environment meant something far beyond what any human had previously experienced. Alvarenga now faced the Pacific Ocean as the only person for thousands of kilometers in every direction, floating in a space larger than all the continents combined. His small boat had become a prison drifting through waters where the nearest human might be on a cargo ship hundreds of kilometers away. The silence was absolute except for the constant sound of waves against his boat and the occasional cry of seabirds that reminded him he was still alive. This isolation was more complete than anything experienced by prisoners in solitary confinement, because at least they knew other humans existed nearby. Talking to himself became essential for maintaining basic sanity in an environment where silence could drive a person insane. Alvarenga created elaborate conversations with imaginary companions, speaking aloud to family members who had no idea of his desperate situation. He would describe his daily activities in detail, explaining to invisible listeners how he caught fish or collected rainwater. These one-sided dialogues provided the human interaction his mind desperately needed, even though he understood the conversations were not real. The sound of his own voice became a lifeline that connected him to his humanity when everything else seemed designed to strip it away. Daily routines became crucial anchors that gave structure to days that otherwise blended into meaningless suffering. Alvarenga established specific times for checking his water supply, searching for food, and maintaining his makeshift shelter. He would spend hours each morning scanning the horizon for ships or land, even though he knew the chances of seeing anything were almost zero. These activities provided purpose and control in a situation where he had no power over his fate. The routines helped him maintain a connection to normal life, where actions had meaning and daily tasks served a purpose beyond simple survival. Mental exercises became as important as physical survival techniques for preventing complete psychological breakdown. He created elaborate fantasies about returning home, describing in vivid detail the first meal he would eat and the conversations he would have with family members. These imaginary scenarios occupied his mind for hours at a time, providing escape from the crushing reality of his situation. He would practice speeches he planned to give about his experience, rehearsing the words he would use to describe his ordeal to people who could never truly understand what he had endured. The physical changes to his body after months of survival were shocking and irreversible. His weight dropped from 85 kilograms to just 55 kilograms, leaving him skeletal and weak. The constant exposure to tropical sun had turned his skin into leather that was permanently damaged by radiation. His muscles had atrophied from lack of proper nutrition and the inability to exercise normally in the confined space of his boat. His clothes had disintegrated into rags that provided almost no protection from the elements. The lack of essential nutrients caused his hair to fall out and his teeth to become loose in his gums. Ocean creatures became his only companions in a world where human contact no longer existed. Alvarenga developed relationships with fish that swam near his boat, giving them names and talking to them as if they were pets. Seabirds that landed on his vessel became temporary friends that provided brief moments of interaction before he was forced to kill them for food. He learned to recognize individual turtles that appeared regularly, treating them as familiar faces in an otherwise empty world. These connections with marine life provided psychological comfort that helped prevent complete mental collapse. Tracking time without a calendar or clock required developing primitive methods that connected him to the passage of days and months. Alvarenga counted lunar cycles by watching the moon change phases, using this ancient technique to maintain awareness of how long his ordeal had lasted. He marked significant events by their relationship to moon phases, creating a personal calendar that helped him maintain hope. This time-tracking system provided evidence that his situation was temporary rather than permanent, giving him a framework for believing that rescue might eventually come. Hallucinations became regular occurrences as his mind struggled to process the extreme isolation and physical stress. He would see islands on the horizon that disappeared when he looked directly at them, or hear voices calling his name from across the water. These episodes were terrifying because they made him question his grip on reality at times when clear thinking was essential for survival. The boundary between real and imaginary experiences became increasingly blurred as months passed without normal human interaction. He learned to recognize when his mind was creating false perceptions, but could not prevent them from occurring. Finding motivation to continue living when death seemed preferable to ongoing suffering required drawing on inner strength that most people never discover. Alvarenga's Christian faith provided crucial support during the darkest moments, when suicide seemed like the only escape from unbearable conditions. He would pray for hours, asking for strength to endure another day of suffering. The memory of his family became a powerful motivation that prevented him from surrendering to despair. He imagined their grief if he gave up, and this concern for their emotional well-being helped him fight through moments when continuing seemed impossible. His expertise at reading ocean signs and weather patterns grew sophisticated enough to predict conditions days in advance. Alvarenga learned to interpret cloud formations, wind patterns, and wave characteristics with accuracy that rivaled modern weather forecasting. He could detect the approach of storms hours before they arrived, giving him time to prepare his water collection system. His ability to locate fish and birds improved dramatically as he learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated their presence. This growing expertise transformed him from a victim of circumstances into someone who could actively influence his chances of survival. The mental strength required to survive month after month alone pushed human endurance beyond previously recorded limits. Each day brought new challenges that tested his will to continue, from extended periods without food to storms that threatened to sink his boat. The psychological pressure of knowing that rescue was unlikely created a constant battle against despair that required superhuman determination. His ability to maintain hope despite overwhelming evidence that his situation was hopeless demonstrated mental toughness that defied normal human limitations. The endless blue ocean that surrounded him became both his prison and his provider, offering the resources he needed to survive while threatening to drive him insane with its vastness. This paradox defined his existence as he learned to extract life from an environment designed to kill him. The skills he developed during these months of isolation would prove essential when an opportunity for rescue finally presented itself, though by then his ordeal had already exceeded anything previously recorded in maritime history. After months of complete isolation, scanning the horizon had become such an automatic routine that he almost missed the moment when something finally appeared that would change everything. The ship that didn't stop. A cargo ship appeared on the horizon, its massive hull cutting through the water like a floating city. The vessel was still kilometers away, but it was the first sign of human civilization he had seen since Córdoba's death. This was his chance for rescue, his opportunity to escape the endless blue prison that had held him captive for so long. The ship moved slowly across the horizon, following what appeared to be a predetermined course that might bring it within signaling distance of his tiny boat. Alvarenga began his frantic efforts to attract attention while the ship was still far away. He waved his arms above his head in sweeping motions, creating the largest visual signal possible with his skeletal frame. His voice, weakened by months of dehydration and poor nutrition, called out across the water even though he knew the crew could not hear him from such a distance. He grabbed pieces of clothing and metal from his boat, waving them frantically to create movement that might catch the eye of someone on deck. Every piece of reflective material became a potential signaling device, as he tried to create flashes of light that might be visible from the approaching vessel. The cargo ship continued its steady approach, growing larger as it moved across the ocean surface. Alvarenga could make out details of the vessel's structure, including the bridge where crew members would be stationed. His excitement grew as he realized the ship's course would bring it close enough for visual contact. He positioned himself in the most visible part of his boat, continuing his desperate signaling efforts with renewed energy. The possibility of rescue after months of suffering gave him strength he had not felt since the early days of his ordeal. As the ship drew closer, Alvarenga could see figures moving on the deck and bridge. The crew members appeared to be going about their normal duties, unaware that a man who had been lost at sea for months was frantically trying to get their attention. He increased his signaling efforts, jumping up and down in his small boat while waving everything he could find. His movements created splashing sounds as waves rocked his vessel, but he ignored the discomfort in his desperate attempt to be seen. The ship was now close enough that he could make out individual people on deck. The crushing moment came when crew members actually noticed him and waved back. Several figures on the ship raised their hands in acknowledgement, clearly seeing Alvarenga and his distressed vessel. For a brief instant, he felt overwhelming relief as he realized his signals had been successful. The crew had seen him, they knew he was there, and rescue seemed finally within reach. He waved back enthusiastically, expecting the massive vessel to begin changing course to come to his aid. The international maritime protocols that required ships to assist vessels in distress should have guaranteed his rescue at this moment. The devastating realization hit him as the cargo ship maintained its course without any reduction in speed. The crew members who had waved were simply acknowledging his presence, not signaling that they were coming to help. The ship continued on its predetermined route, carrying its cargo to some distant destination while leaving Alvarenga floating helplessly in its wake. The acknowledgement had been nothing more than a polite gesture, like waving to a neighbor across the street rather than responding to a desperate plea for help. Alvarenga's emotional breakdown was immediate and complete. He screamed at the departing ship, using every curse word he knew in Spanish while tears streamed down his sun-damaged face. The psychological impact of watching his rescue sail away was more devastating than months of physical suffering. He had been so close to salvation that he could see the faces of people who chose not to help him. The ship's wake rocked his small boat as it passed, creating waves that seemed to mock his desperate situation. The sound of the ship's engines faded into the distance, leaving him alone again in the vast Pacific. Several factors might have influenced the ship's decision not to stop and render assistance. Maritime protocols in 2012 were less strictly enforced than modern regulations, and captains sometimes hesitated to deviate from their schedules for rescue operations. The crew might have feared liability issues or complications that could arise from taking on a distressed survivor. Language barriers could have prevented clear communication about the severity of his situation. Some merchant vessels lacked proper rescue equipment or trained personnel to conduct safe recovery operations in open ocean conditions. The possibility exists that the crew simply misjudged the situation's severity. From their perspective on a large cargo ship, Alvarenga's small boat might have appeared to be a local fisherman rather than someone in desperate need of rescue. The visual signals that seemed obvious to him might have been interpreted as friendly greetings rather than distress calls. Without radio communication or other clear indicators of emergency, the crew might have assumed he was fishing normally rather than fighting for survival after months at sea. Modern maritime law requires ships to assist distressed vessels under SALAS Regulation 33 and UNCLOS Article 98, creating legal obligations that were less clearly enforced in 2012. Today's advanced communication systems allow for better coordination between vessels and rescue services, while improved training ensures that crew members can better recognize distress situations. GPS tracking systems and satellite communications have made it easier to verify genuine emergencies and coordinate proper rescue responses. The incident's effect on Alvarenga's mental state was profound and long-lasting. The near miss with rescue created a psychological trauma that competed with his physical suffering for dominance over his will to survive. He had allowed himself to hope for the first time in months, only to have that hope crushed by human indifference. The knowledge that people had seen him and chosen not to help created a bitter anger that consumed his thoughts for days afterward. The incident forced him to confront the reality that even when human contact was possible, salvation was not guaranteed. This moment could have destroyed his hope entirely and ended his will to continue fighting for survival. Many people would have given up after such a devastating psychological blow, but something deeper than hope had begun to sustain him. The experience taught him that rescue would come only through his own persistence, rather than the kindness of strangers. As the ship disappeared beyond the horizon, Alvarenga was left to face the reality that his ordeal was far from over. The Pacific Ocean continued to carry him further from everything he had ever known, but he had already survived longer than anyone thought possible. 11 months and 8,000 kilometers later. 11 months and 8,000 kilometers later, Alvarenga had become something that defied every known limit of human survival. The Pacific Ocean had carried him in a massive arc across its surface, moving him further from his Mexican homeland than the distance. Between New York and Los Angeles, ocean currents had become his transportation system, carrying him through water that few humans had ever seen. The North Equatorial Current had grabbed his small boat and pulled it westward at speeds that varied between 1 and 4 kilometers per hour, depending on weather conditions and seasonal changes. This relentless drift had taken him through waters so remote that cargo ships might not pass through them for months at a time. His physical condition represented the absolute limits of what the human body could endure and still function. The clothes he had worn when leaving Mexico were now shredded rags that provided almost no protection from the blazing tropical sun. 11 months of constant exposure had turned his skin into something resembling leather, with deep cracks and permanent damage from ultraviolet radiation. His hair had become brittle and thin, while his fingernails had grown long and yellowed from malnutrition. The weight loss was shocking even by the standards of extreme survival situations. His body had consumed its own muscle tissue and fat reserves, leaving him skeletal and weak. The sun damage covered every exposed part of his body with painful precision. His face bore the marks of months without protection, with deep lines and discoloration that made him appear decades older than his actual age. His hands had become tools hardened by constant use, with calluses thick enough to handle sharp fish bones and turtle shells without injury. The salt water had created sores on his skin that healed slowly or not at all, leaving permanent scars that would mark his ordeal for life. His feet had swollen from constant exposure to moisture, making movement painful even within the confines of his small boat. Ocean currents had carried him through multiple climate zones during his drift across the Pacific. The Kuroshio current had influenced his path as he moved through subtropical waters, while the California current had pushed him toward different weather patterns and marine ecosystems. These massive water movements operate on scales that dwarf human understanding, moving billions of tons of water across thousands of kilometers. The currents that carried Alvarenga were part of a global circulation system that connects all the world's oceans, meaning his journey was guided by forces that affect weather patterns and marine life across the entire planet. His survival skills had evolved into something approaching superhuman expertise. Alvarenga could now catch small fish with his bare hands using techniques that would impress professional fishermen. He had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when birds were about to land on his boat, positioning himself for lightning-fast captures that provided crucial protein. His ability to predict weather patterns had become so accurate that he could prepare for storms hours before they arrived. The techniques he had developed for collecting and storing rainwater were more efficient than many modern survival systems. Reading ocean signs had become second nature to him after months of constant observation. He could interpret wave patterns to determine wind direction and strength, while cloud formations revealed approaching weather systems with remarkable precision. The behavior of marine life provided information about underwater currents and the presence of larger predators that might threaten his safety. Floating debris told him about distant storms and shipping routes, while the color and movement of water revealed information about depth and current speed. These skills represented knowledge that most professional sailors never develop, even after decades of experience. The mental transformation from desperate victim to hardened survivor was complete after 11 months of unimaginable suffering. Alvarenga had developed psychological techniques that allowed him to maintain hope despite overwhelming evidence that rescue was impossible. His mind had adapted to extreme isolation by creating elaborate internal worlds where he could find temporary escape from his physical reality. The fear that had dominated his early months at sea had been replaced by a grim determination that kept him functioning when most people would have surrendered to despair. His mental strength had grown to match his physical endurance, creating a combination that seemed beyond normal human capabilities. His body had adapted to extreme conditions in ways that medical science struggles to explain. The human digestive system is not designed to process raw fish, bird blood, and other substances that had become his regular diet. Yet somehow his body had learned to extract nutrients from these sources. His kidneys had adapted to processing salt water and other liquids that would normally cause severe illness or death. The constant exposure to sun and salt water should have caused fatal dehydration and skin damage, but his body had developed tolerance levels that seemed impossible. His cardiovascular system had adjusted to the physical stress of constant survival activities while operating on minimal nutrition. Daily routines had become the foundation of his continued existence. Each morning began with checking his water supply and assessing weather conditions for the day ahead. He would spend hours scanning the horizon for ships or land, even though he knew the chances of seeing anything were minimal. Food gathering required constant attention, watching for birds or fish that might provide his next meal. Maintaining his makeshift shelter and repairing damage from storms occupied significant portions of each day. These activities provided structure and purpose that prevented complete psychological breakdown. His endurance had transcended normal human limitations and entered territory that seemed almost supernatural. The combination of physical adaptation, mental strength, and sheer determination had created a survivor who could function in conditions that would kill most people within days. His ability to maintain hope after months of suffering demonstrated psychological resilience that defied scientific understanding. The skills he had developed represented a masterclass in survival that could only be learned through the most extreme circumstances imaginable. After 11 months of endless blue water, subtle changes in his environment began to suggest that his impossible journey might finally be approaching a conclusion. Different species of birds appeared more frequently, while the water itself carried new scents and debris that hinted at proximity to land. His evolved survival skills allowed him to recognize these signs and understand their significance, creating the first genuine hope for rescue that he had felt in many months. The miracle of Ebon Atoll. Fresh coconuts floating in the water around his boat created unmistakable signs that land existed somewhere nearby. These brown husks bobbing on the ocean surface had clearly fallen from palm trees growing on solid ground, meaning his endless drift across the Pacific was finally approaching inhabited territory. Different species of birds began landing on his boat more frequently, including varieties he had not seen during his months in the open ocean. These birds flew in patterns that suggested they were traveling between roosting sites rather than simply wandering across empty water. The approach to what appeared to be an island required extreme caution from someone who had been fooled by mirages and hallucinations for months. Alvarenga's eyes had played tricks on him countless times during his ordeal, creating phantom islands and rescue ships that disappeared when he looked directly at them. This time felt different because the signs were consistent and grew stronger as he drifted closer to the source. The water around his boat changed color from deep blue to lighter shades that indicated shallow areas and coral reefs. The smell of land reached him on the wind, carrying scents of vegetation and earth that he had not experienced since leaving Mexico. Ebon Atoll emerged from the Pacific like something from a dream after 438 days of endless ocean. The ring-shaped coral reef encircled a lagoon in the classic formation of Pacific atolls, with palm trees visible along the shoreline and white sand beaches that seemed impossibly beautiful after months of seeing nothing but water. The emotional impact of seeing solid ground was overwhelming for someone who had begun to believe he would never set foot on land again. Tears streamed down his sun-damaged face as he realized that his incredible journey across the Pacific might finally be ending. The physical challenge of leaving his boat for the first time in over a year tested his body in ways he had not anticipated. His legs had adapted to the constant motion of his small vessel, making solid ground feel strange and unstable beneath his feet. The muscles in his legs had atrophied from months of inactivity, leaving him weak and unsteady as he attempted to walk on the beach. His feet had swollen from constant exposure to salt water, making each step painful as he struggled to move across the sand. The simple act of standing upright without the support of his boat required tremendous effort from someone whose body had adapted to survival rather than normal human movement. Alvarenga discovered a house on the atoll that seemed too good to be true after his ordeal in the empty Pacific. The structure appeared solid and inhabited, with signs of recent human activity that indicated people lived on this remote island. His approach to the building was careful and deliberate, as he feared that his appearance might frighten whoever lived inside. He was naked, skeletal, and covered in sun damage that made him look like something from a horror movie rather than a fellow human being. The moment of knocking on the door represented the end of his isolation and the beginning of his return to human society. the shock experienced by Emmy Libick-Meadow and Russell Kidrick when they found this skeletal stranger was immediate and profound. These Marshall Islands residents encountered a man who was shouting in Spanish and looked like he had risen from the dead. His appearance was so disturbing that they initially struggled to understand what they were seeing. The naked figure before them bore little resemblance to a normal human being, with skin like leather and a body that seemed to have been destroyed by months of exposure to the elements. His attempts to communicate in Spanish created additional confusion, as the residents had no way of understanding his desperate explanations about his ordeal. The geographical miracle of reaching Ebon Atoll represented odds that defied mathematical calculation. The Marshall Islands comprise 29 atolls and 5 individual islands scattered across approximately 750,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean, with a total population of only 60,000 people. Ebon Atoll sits at one of the southernmost points of this island nation, making it an extremely unlikely destination for someone drifting randomly across the Pacific. The atoll's position in the ocean currents created a narrow window of possibility that Alvarenga's boat could reach inhabited land rather than continuing to drift through empty ocean for months or years. The coral reef structure of Ebon Atoll created conditions that allowed someone in Alvarenga's condition to survive reaching shore. The lagoon provided calm water where his boat could safely approach land without being destroyed by large waves. The shallow areas around the reef gave him opportunities to wade to shore rather than attempting dangerous swimming in his weakened condition. The presence of fresh water and food sources on the atoll meant that even if rescue had been delayed, he might have survived longer than on most other Pacific islands. Medical attention came immediately as the Marshall Islands residents recognized the severity of his condition. Alvarenga was transported to a hospital in Majuro, the capital of the Marshall Islands, where medical teams began addressing the effects of his 438-day ordeal. His severe dehydration required immediate intravenous fluids, while his low blood pressure indicated that his cardiovascular system was operating at the edge of failure. The swollen ankles were symptoms of malnutrition and circulation problems that had developed during months of survival on inadequate nutrition. The challenge of returning to human society proved almost as difficult as his survival at sea. After 11 days in the hospital, doctors deemed him healthy enough to return to El Salvador, but his psychological adjustment would take much longer. He was diagnosed with anemia that reflected the long-term effects of his inadequate diet during the ordeal. Sleep became difficult as his body struggled to readjust to normal patterns after months of constant vigilance at sea. The development of a fear of water represented the psychological trauma that would persist long after his physical recovery was complete. Against all odds, mathematical probability, and medical understanding of human survival limits, Alvarenga had accomplished something that challenged every assumption about what humans can endure. His arrival at Ebon Atoll marked the end of an ordeal that would force the world to reconsider the boundaries of human resilience when faced with circumstances that should have been fatal. Alvarenga's rescue marked the end of the longest survival at sea in recorded history. His 438-day ordeal pushed the boundaries of physical and mental endurance beyond anything previously documented in maritime records. Modern 2025 technology has dramatically reduced ocean survival incidents through GPS emergency beacons, satellite phones, and AI-powered rescue systems that can locate distressed vessels within hours rather than days. These advances have made stories like Alvarenga's far less likely to occur. Yet the ocean remains humanity's greatest survival challenge. Despite sophisticated tracking systems and improved safety protocols, the Pacific's vastness still defeats even the most advanced rescue technology when people disappear without transmitting distress signals. Somewhere in our vast oceans, the next survival story may already be beginning.